Good evening, everyone, and thank you again for your patience as we get things started. Welcome this evening. My name is Shoshana Buchholz-Miller, and I am the Vice President of Education and Exhibitions here at the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center. We want to start out this evening by thanking our partners for this program. They include the Bosnian American Genocide Institute and Education Center, the Illinois Holocaust and Genocide Commission, the Muslim Community Center Interfaith and Outreach Committee, Unsilence, the Chicago South Sudanese Community Center, and the National Cambodian Heritage Museum and Killing Fields Memorial. I also want to thank particularly the American Jewish World Service. They are here this evening, and they have been working in Myanmar for decades. And so we're really lucky to have them here tonight, and I would just commend you for the to talk, if you get a chance to speak with someone there and learn the work they do. And I also want to highlight our partner, the Rohingya Cultural Center in Chicago. They work with the local Rohingyan community, and if you would like to learn more about what they do locally, I'd recommend you speaking with them after the program. I also want to acknowledge our CEO, Susan Abrams, who is here this evening. And yay for Susan. And we were so disappointed that we had to cancel this event last month because of the weather, and we're really grateful to you who could make it out this evening. Just a question, a show of hands, who's never been to the museum before? Who's new to the museum? Oh, good, there's a whole bunch of you. Well, welcome. Thank you so much for coming this evening. We're so glad that you're here. And of course, for those of you who've been here before, welcome back. We're very grateful to you as well. For those who aren't as familiar with us, we have programs like this regularly. And so we would really encourage you to take a program as you leave to learn about the other events that we're having. I also wanted to mention a new exhibition that we just opened today. Sadly, this is the 7th anniversary of the start of the Syrian civil war and genocide. And that's a very, very sad anniversary to be acknowledging, but we wanted to use that as an opportunity to open a new exhibition called Where the Children Sleep. It's up on our second floor, and it is a photographic exhibition by a Swedish photographer of Syrian refugee children and taken in various places along their journey as refugees from within Syria through Beirut and through Turkey and through Europe and ultimately in Sweden. And I think it's really a call to action for all of us. So I would recommend a visit to that as well. Some people may ask why we are having this program this evening. And I just want to reiterate what an important part of our mission it is. Our mission states that we remember the past we must remember the past and transform the future. And so therefore, it's our obligation here to educate, to share the human stories, give people tools to take action, speak truth to power, which is the name of our special exhibition currently downstairs. And so this just fits very much into the mission of what we do. And we want people here tonight to be able to find your voice and be upstanders in the face of this horror. And we are very lucky this evening because we have 3 esteemed panelists. We have Dr. Zaher Sahloul on the far end. We have Dr. Azeem Ibrahim, and we have Senator Dick Durbin. And I hope the senator will forgive me because I don't have as full a bio for him as I do for the other 2 gentlemen, but I feel like he needs no introduction here. So perhaps, he'll allow me that little failing. So before, I'm going to sit down and we'll have a conversation, but I just want to give a little bit of background on Dr. Sahloul and Dr. Ibrahim. Dr. Ibrahim is a research professor at the Strategic Studies Institute and the U.S. Army War College and a senior fellow at the Center for Global Policy in Washington. He completed his PhD from the University of Cambridge and served as an international security fellow at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, World Fellow at Yale, and a Rothermere Fellow at the University of Oxford. I also learned this evening that he was a teacher at University of Chicago for 4 years, so he is also kind of a local boy. And he has written the Rohingyas Inside Myanmar's Hidden Genocide. And I will say it is a must read. It is kind of the book on the Rohingya and incredibly prescient regarding the situation we're in today. We are selling it in the shop if you are interested after the program. And then I just want to talk a little bit about Dr. Sahloul, and thank you, Dr. Ibrahim, for being here. Dr. Sahloul is an associate clinical professor at the University of Illinois College of Medicine and is a practicing physician in pulmonary and critical care medicine. He is immediate past president of Syrian American Medical Society, SAMS, a humanitarian and advocacy organization that provides medical relief to Syrians and Syrian refugees. He is also the founder of MedGlobal, which works in difficult-to-reach areas devastated by war and ethnic cleansing, where individuals have poor access to healthcare and many NGOs choose not to venture. To date, they have sent missions to Bangladesh, Yemen, and Puerto Rico. And lest we think that Dr. Sahloul only writes and organizes, he has risked his life to provide medical care in Syria, in such cities as Aleppo, when they were under siege, and to put the health of others above himself. So we're very honored to have him with us too this evening. So I'm gonna make my way over there and hopefully not hurt anyone's ears when I turn this on. What I'm hoping to do this evening is that I will ask some questions, but we also want to open questions to the audience. So we'd like this to be a conversation. So I'm going to take the prerogative of starting with a couple of questions, and then I'm happy to have you raise your hand as you think of questions. And I'd love to start, I would love to start with Dr. Ibrahim to talk a little bit about who are the Rohingya and what is at the heart of the conflict. And then I'm going to turn to Senator Durbin and ask him about his experience visiting Myanmar and his views on the Rohingya situation as a senator. Dr. Ibrahim.
Thank you so much, Shoshana, and thank you so much for the Illinois Holocaust Museum for hosting this very important event. The Rohingya, as you're probably aware, is one of the greatest humanitarian crises in the world. They have been described by the United Nations as the most persecuted minority in the world. They have faced wave after wave of violence over the last half century. But the origins of this crisis can be traced back just to the Second World War, and I'll give you a very quick synopsis of where this all started. When the Japanese invaded what was at that time British Burma, the majority Buddhist population sided with the Japanese invaders, believing that the Japanese are going to be victorious and this is going to lead to swifter independence, whereas a minority Rohingya population within Burma, within Myanmar, about 5% of the population, stayed loyal to the British colonial masters. So after the country did become independent, there was bad blood between the two people. The Rohingya were looked at with suspicion because they did not support the Buddhist majority. But despite that, there was relative calm up until 1962, when there was a military coup by the army chief, General Ne Win, and he tried to implement what he called the Burmese Road to Socialism, which was a communist manifesto, and this was a complete economic disaster. So he did what a lot of authoritarian dictators do in that situation. They tried to look for scapegoats on whom to blame all the ills of society on, and the Rohingya minority, who were already looked at with suspicion, were the minority of choice for this blame. And he also became much more overtly Buddhist in his outlook. He started passing laws to say that only Buddhists can be loyal citizens of this country and everybody else is disloyal. And this culminated a number of laws up until 1982, the Nationality and Citizenship Act, which stripped all the Rohingya of their citizenship, making them the largest stateless people in the world. And time after that, they have faced waves of violence. Now, just very quickly, the fundamental accusation against the Rohingya is that this term Rohingya does not exist. This is a manufactured term, that these people, they are all illegal immigrants from Bangladesh, and they made up this term, and some of them even put a date on it. They say they made up this term in 1942, and before that time this term did not exist, and they are all illegal Bengalis, and they should all go back to Bangladesh, hence why the military and Myanmar authorities are pushing them out. And one of the things I do in my book is examine the veracity of this claim, and it's patently false because I've dug up documents from the Indian National Archives dating back to British Burma, 1824, 1799, which show that the Rohingya have been part of that landscape. So it's a very lengthy period of time in which, as you'll know in this institution, that genocides don't happen overnight. They take a long time for the dehumanization and the otherization to occur, and the Rohingya have been experiencing this for half a century now.
Thank you. So, Senator Durbin, I know that you were in Myanmar not long ago, so maybe you can tell us a little bit about your visit, what prompted it, and kind of what you learned while you were there.
It was November when Jan Schakowsky, myself, Senator Merkley of Oregon, two other members of the House went to both Myanmar, Burma, and Bangladesh. We went there because Aung San Suu Kyi, the one who won the Nobel Peace Prize for her courage in living in isolation for more than a decade, invited the world to come see. She said, come see the Rakhine State, which is the area that is in question here where the Rohingya people were living, and see for yourself. So we took her up on it, and we arranged our trip to Myanmar, only to learn when we arrived that they would not give us access to this area. They wouldn't let us see it. Our ambassador, who was there and had seen it, described what he saw: burnout villages. That didn't fit the narrative of the Myanmar government. So Aung San Suu Kyi's invitation was worth nothing to us. And we asked to see her, and she couldn't work us into her schedule. So it was frustrating in that regard, but we spent the time in Myanmar, I think valuable time. I think they may have made a mistake at one point, because they allowed us to enter one of the, I hesitate to use the word concentration camp, but they have isolated the Rohingya population within many of their cities in barbed wire enclaves. They've been behind barbed wire for 4.5 years. They have armed guards with rifles that stand by the gates, the entryways to these camps. The people live there with nothing. They have no economy. They can't work at all. They've been removed from their shops and their businesses. Their movement is restricted within this area and such. The one we visited is in the city of Sitwe, and it's known as Ong Mingalar. And it was a stark experience. The closest I asked people there, what is a parallel in history to these camps for the Rohingya who remain, the ones who haven't left the country? And one woman said it reminded her of apartheid in South Africa. But I said, under apartheid, the blacks who lived in these isolated areas would come into the white areas to work and then go back. If you've read any books about it, spending hours each day traveling back and forth and back and forth. So you're not allowed to leave this area and work. If you're Rohingya, you're confined in this area. And one other person said, the closest analogy in history is the Warsaw Ghetto. It is a similar circumstance. It is a ghetto arrangement. For example, if you are a young woman about to give birth to a baby, listen to this, you have to leave, you're escorted out of this camp to the only hospital which treats Rohingyas. It's 2 hours away. You make the trip there to get permission to verify the fact you're in fact in labor, to get permission to come back to another hospital 2 hours away that is 5 minutes from the camp. 4-hour round trip of a woman in labor to get permission to go to a hospital that's 5 minutes away from this camp. That's the kind of awful situation that confronts them. I would just say thank you, Dr. Ibrahim, for your book, because it really could not come at a more important moment in history. I've never been in a place where when you'd say a word like Rohingya, they'd stop and correct you. There's no such thing. The Rohingya people do not exist. They are Bengalis. They belong in Bangladesh. Don't use the word Rohingya. I've never been in a circumstance like that, where there's just a denial of the existence of a group. We went to Bangladesh. Now there are 600, we believe, who knows for sure, 680,000 maybe, who have journeyed, walked for days, or paid a king's ransom in local currency to have a boat trip across the Naf River into these refugee camps in Bangladesh. They've left Myanmar next door because villages have been burned, people have been killed, women have been raped, infants have been stripped out of their hands and thrown into fires. All of this, I believe, is credible. I believe what they say is true. Why else would they do that? And you ask the people in the Rakhine State, the Myanmar people, what actually happened? They burned their own villages. Really? Why? So they could leave and establish international support and sympathy? Why? So they can come back and take over our homes here? The most irrational, outlandish arguments to explain what has happened to these people. When you come see them over in these refugee camps, and Dr. Sahloul, who's one of my heroes, almost as much as his wife Suzanne, who's my other hero in this experience, can tell you, when we went into a room filled with women waiting to see a doctor, many with nursing infants, and said, "Why are you here?" They said, "Because my husband was killed, my baby was killed. We had no place to go, we were burned out." Really, there were fires, and women would come up and show us the scars on their arms from the fires and the burns that they'd been through. All of this being denied by the people in Myanmar. So let me bring it down to the world that I live in. What are we doing about it as a nation? And the answer is almost nothing. We are supportive of Bangladesh. We provide aid in that circumstance. But those of us who tried on a bipartisan basis to force a statement from Congress, let alone the administration, about these atrocities have had little or no luck. It turns out everyone seems to lean toward doing it, but it's been stopped in the Senate by Senator McConnell. He has taken a personal interest in Burma, Myanmar over the years. He has developed a close friendship with Aung San Suu Kyi, and he just doesn't want to entertain any resolution that is critical of Myanmar. Despite the fact that their history, as we know, is checkered, they have discriminated against many different groups within their borders. And so we have been stymied. What needs to be done clearly is to allow NGOs to go into the Rakhine State to see who is left there and how they're being treated in Myanmar. Secondly, to make sure that if there's any return of these refugees to Myanmar, that it's with United Nations supervision, and to make certain as well that they are returned to a status, as Dr. Ibrahim said, they're stateless people. They don't have any credible status within Myanmar to vote, to elect their own, none of that. So all of those, I think, are critical to this. I thank the Holocaust Museum for many things, but for realizing that the tragedy of Shoah, which is probably the motivating force for the creation of this museum, is something that can never be forgotten, should never be forgotten, but it is not the only atrocity in the world, not the only tragedy. And the fact that you have engaged us, those of us who are not Jewish, in this conversation, I really thank you. I'm sure that those who created this museum had this in mind, and I'm glad to be part of this program this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Durbin. I want to bring Zaher, Dr. Sahloul, into the conversation. Tell us a little bit about what is happening on the ground. I mean, we've heard some of it from Senator Durbin, but what's happening on the ground with the Rohingya people in the camps, in the refugee camps that are in Bangladesh? I know that you've had a chance to visit them, so tell us a little bit about that.
So first of all, I'm really honored to be here. This is my, I think, 5th or 6th visit to the museum, and I spoke about Syria. I'm originally from Syria. I'm a physician practicing medicine in Christ Advocate Medical Center and another hospital called St. Anthony's. And I think Senator Durbin mentioned that our nation is not doing much, but I believe that individuals and organizations and NGOs can do more than our nation. And we can touch the lives of people and can influence what's happening among our policymakers. Senator Durbin will attest to the fact that when doctors and individuals and citizens go to foreign lands and risk their life and then come back with stories that will influence you and influence our policies. And so I think I believe that we have responsibility to tell the world and our senators and congressmen, State Department, that this is happening and you have to pay attention to it. Because eventually what happens in these areas, even though that we don't see it on the media, it will affect us. I believe in what Martin Luther King has said, that you cannot segregate your moral concerns. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So when we had the Syrian crisis, and initially we said, well, it's happening in the Middle East, we cannot influence what's happening in the Middle East, it's not going to affect us. After that, we discovered that the 5.5 million refugees have not only destabilized the region in the Middle East, but also they destabilized Europe. It created anti-refugee, anti-immigrant sentiment. It gave the rise to hate group, right group, Brexit, election of certain individuals who have certain sentiments. So what happens over there will affect us eventually. So if we don't care about humanity, if we care only about what's happening in the United States, we have to care about what's happening in the Rohingya. This is the worst humanitarian crisis in our lifetime. 800,000 people, according to some estimates, fled Myanmar in the last few months. And at that time, we started with my colleagues, doctors and nurses, discussing what can we do. So we said, okay, maybe we can send medical mission to Myanmar, to the Rakhine state, but it was blocked. The Myanmar government will not allow any NGOs to come and treat people in Myanmar. So said Bangladesh, there's large refugee camps on the Bangladesh-Myanmar areas. There's a city called Cox's Bazar, which is a reasonable city in terms of infrastructure. And 2 hours from the city at the border, you have all refugee camps. And these are huge refugee camps. I'm going to show some pictures where you stand on top of hill and around you, you see all tents. So it's a sea of tents and sea of humanity. All of these are families that fled Myanmar in the past few months. We treated between 200 to 250 patients every day. Every week we send 5 to 7 doctors and nurses from the US. Dr. Ibrahim's wife led our committee to take care of the refugees. She's a pediatrician from Chicago. We had, until now, about 120 doctors who went to Bangladesh to treat the Rohingya patients. Not only they provide medical care, but they also touched their life. And for someone who lost everything and they live in a tent, when they see a doctor or a nurse coming from the United States of America because of they care, and these doctors are paying for their own airline ticket and their lodging, and they're spending 1 week or 2 weeks in Bangladesh to treat these patients, that means a lot to these individuals. And you will never imagine how happy they are when they see a doctor or a nurse coming from the US to treat them. And we treat many conditions that are very common in the refugee population. So these patients have chronic diseases like we do. They have hypertension, diabetes, heart disease, and so forth. They have also infectious conditions because there's lack of vaccination. There's crowding in the tents, a lot of respiratory issues and colds and viral infections. We've seen also preventable diseases that are common among children because of lack of vaccination, like diphtheria. There is malnutrition and there are injuries because of the trip and the torture that happened to some of them. And there's also psychological trauma, which is probably 80% of them are affected. They have PTSD, they have depression, they have anxiety, and we try to address all of that.
Is there anything different about the Rohingya refugee population that you're seeing, that you're treating, than you've seen in other refugee populations?
I mean, that's very good questions, and sometimes I try to find differences between the refugee population. I treated Syrian refugees, Iraqi refugees, Yemeni displaced people in Yemen. Of course, in the time of disaster, everyone is the same. You know, whether you are American or Syrian or Rohingya, in the disaster you are desperate and you need help. And as humanitarians, we believe that you should provide help to everyone regardless of their ethnic or religious affiliation, and this is called impartiality in medicine. So we're impartial. But these are people who are desperate, who are persecuted for a long time, the most persecuted minority in the world. They lost everything. They don't have that much hope that the world will come to their help. I asked one of the patients in the Rohingya, what do you want me to do when I go back to the United States? I have a voice, I can talk with people and tell policymakers what's happening. He said, we don't expect anything from the world has forgotten us. But if you can convey the picture, that would be good. So I think the level of persecution, the level of psychological trauma is something that distinguishes this community. The fact that they do refuse to go back to their homeland. I spoke with Syrian refugees, even the ones who settled in the US, and they always say, we want to go back to Syria. But these refugees said it's near impossible for them to go to Myanmar because they don't feel safe there. And they don't have future, they don't have hope that they will have opportunities for them and for their children.
So to that, Dr. Ibrahim, so what is a long-term solution here if these refugees are feeling that they can't return home, that they're not safe?
Unfortunately, there's no single large solution to this problem. At the moment, the Myanmar government, the authorities are in discussions with Bangladesh to repatriate the Rohingya. And when this was first announced in November, I wrote a piece in the New York Times arguing that the probability of this happening is next to zero. We have seen this show before. The Myanmar authorities, when they expel the Rohingya, they enter into these discussions with the Bangladeshi government to try to negotiate how to take them back. And this, I believe, and I argued, is a mechanism simply to buy time, to buy as much time as possible until the world's attention moves on to the next crisis and these refugees become a permanent fixture within Bangladesh. And how do we know this? Because we've seen this before. The same thing happened in 92 and 93, 2012, 2013, and 2016. They'll basically take back maybe a few token families as a gesture, and those families are then placed in these, essentially these concentration camps and completely closed off. And they're left in those camps. They're not permitted to leave those camps, but the majority of the refugees will remain in Bangladesh. And if you look at the criteria which the Myanmar government has set up to take these refugees back, it is designed specifically to ensure that none of them ever come back. But before that, what exactly are they going to go back to? The villages have been burnt down. The villages have now been bulldozed and they are building military and security bases on those villages. Amnesty International has obtained satellite imagery confirming all this. When the refugees left, the border was mined between the two countries to ensure none of the refugees come back. And when I was in the camps myself, I spoke to a number of refugees and I asked them if they were willing to go back. And the criteria that was articulated to them to go back was designed to ensure it's impossible to meet. For example, they have to produce birth certificates from their grandfathers to prove that they're from Myanmar. At a time when birth certificates were not issued, they have to produce documentation of which village they were from in Myanmar, villages that have all been burnt down. And then they have to produce documentation of where they crossed the border into Bangladesh. So the equivalent of passports and passport stamps. So this is designed specifically to ensure that none of them will ever come back. The Myanmar authorities have spent half a century trying to get rid of these people. They have finally succeeded in getting rid of the majority of the population, and they will not be taking them back anytime soon. This is something that they have had an ambition for some time. And now the unfortunate thing is, and I've just written a piece on this for Foreign Policy magazine that should be published in the next few weeks, in the next few days, in which I now argue that now that the Myanmar authorities have gotten rid of the Rohingya, they are turning their attention onto other minorities. Myanmar is a country that has had the longest running civil wars in the world. They have been at war with every ethnic minority since independence. And now they have managed to successfully rid their country of the Rohingya. They are turning their attention onto the other minorities, the Karen, the Kashin, the Christian Catholics, the Shan, etc. And we have seen an increase in violence against these other minorities. So this is, as Dr. Sahloul says, is that this is what happens when you let perpetrators get away with these crimes. They are now an emboldened military that believe that, look, we managed to get away with this. There's been no reaction from the international community. The Rohingya are never coming back. Now we can focus on getting rid of the other minorities as well. And this is the unfortunate situation, is that these people will not rest until they believe that they've created a purely Buddhist state.
So, to follow up a little bit on that, Senator Durbin, you referenced Aung San Suu Kyi, who for many years has been revered as a self-sacrificing Nobel Prize winner. What is her role in all of this? What role does she play? And yeah.
It has not been helpful. We have waited for her to show some of the courage which she demonstrated for so many years, defying the Myanmar military when she was under house arrest, and receiving global recognition for her courage. And now, within the borders of her own country, where she maintains a political title created for her, she frankly has been silent and has not led any effort to draw international attention to the plight of these people. I might add one thing to Dr. Ibrahim's comment. Part of what we're reading reflects the fact that there is an election coming up in Bangladesh. The Prime Minister of Bangladesh, a woman, opened up her country for 680,000 refugees, maybe more. And you can imagine that within Bangladesh, not a rich country, that has some controversy associated with it, bringing in all of these people, even with international support that they might be receiving. And so what they have said, the narrative from the start, has been they're only here temporarily. They're going back. I couldn't agree with you more. There's nothing to go back to. And as I mentioned earlier, who in the world would go back to a circumstance like the one that they left, where their villages were burned and their families were murdered? I can't imagine it, but I think part of the conversation about repatriation is for domestic Bangladeshi consumption so the Prime Minister can get through her election cycle.
Can I just follow up on that? Because the question of Aung San Suu Kyi is the most common question people pose of Myanmar. Almost every policymaker I've met over the last 5 years, this is the first question that they ask. I wrote a piece in Newsweek in November. Our title was How We Were Seduced by Aung San Suu Kyi. And for that piece, I interviewed half a dozen people who have known her intimately for decades. For example, the person who was the founder of the Free Aung San Suu Kyi campaign in the 1980s. There was another individual who used to smuggle papers to her in prison. And there was an Australian member of parliament who was the first Westerner to meet with her after she was released from house arrest. All of them told me on the record that, look, she's a Burma Buddhist nationalist. She always has been. The fact is that we simply overlooked her shortcomings because we needed an icon for these for this situation. And this is a shortcoming that we in the West have, is that we like to have our heroes on a pedestal, untarnished. You know, we like to have these people who have come to the West, been educated in the West, tasted Western democracy, and are going to go back to their countries, their uncivilized, backward countries, and make their countries like our country. And her story is one of the best stories you'll ever hear. The daughter of one of the founding generals of Myanmar, placed under house arrest by her father's former colleagues, educated at Oxford, speaks the Queen's English, beautiful, articulate, Nobel laureate, opening up her country now she's out of prison. This is fantastic. This is the stuff we make movies out of. So we overlook all the actual shortcomings that she actually has. And if you look at some of her early writings and her speeches and so on, she's explicitly a Buddhist nationalist, and she always has been. You look at her some of her speeches, and I could tell you stories which I won't because of the time constraint. But if you look at my piece, I make the argument that this is a shortcoming that we in the West have had, and we make this mistake over and over again. And I'll just very quickly, if you remember, we made the same mistake with Bashar al-Assad, the London-trained ophthalmologist being quoted by Tony Blair, who's going to reform his country, turned out to be one of the great mass murderers of our time. Or a good example now is Kim Jong-un, educated at a Swiss boarding school, loves Disneyland and basketball, is going to bring his country in from the cold. Now he's threatening us all with nuclear annihilation. We make this mistake over and over again that these people are the elite in their societies, and when they go to Oxford, Georgetown, they become the elite of the elite, and they're ideologically committed, and we just overlook that because it fits with our need and our narrative to have these people on a pedestal.
Thank you. It's a lot to think about. And I also want to just quickly thank our CEO, Susan Abrams, because she also delivers water. We appreciate that, Susan, for that. I want to ask a little bit about, so we're the people who are here tonight who decided to come out on a Thursday evening and learn about the Rohingya. This is a group that clearly is interested, knows some about the topic, and wants to learn more. But this is all the things that you're sharing are even beyond what I, who have read up on this, are more than I knew when I came in here. And so I imagine, and I know that the rest of the general population knows much less, and the population in America. So why is there, and I'll start with you, Dr. Sahloul, why do you think that there is little interest, little knowledge about these people and what is happening in Myanmar and Bangladesh here in the United States?
I mean, that's an excellent question. I was in your annual dinner last week, and congratulations for the dinner. That was an amazing event. For those who did not attend it, I think 2,800 people attended the dinner. I was touched by some of the comments from Holocaust survivor who mentioned that at the time of the Holocaust, people knew what's happening, but they did not do anything to stop it. So sometimes we know that things are happening that are evil in some parts of the world, but we either don't pay attention because we think that these people are not connected to us, or because the media does not highlight the situation, or because we don't believe that we have to do something, that these are people who are killing each others for a long time. And that was the sentiment that I faced when I talked about Syria, for example, over the past 6 years, that, okay, people in the Middle East have been killing each other for a long time, or that we don't know really who is the victim. It's complex, or that it's fake news. But I think it's very important for us, first of all, to pay attention to these atrocities and war crimes. Eventually, it will come back to haunt us. Just last week, I think Russia used nerve gas in London, and 500 people were affected by nerve gas. The fact that we allowed Assad and his allies, Iran and Russia, to use chemical weapons 200 times in Syria, we normalized what is supposed to be not normal. That allowed other regimes to use it with impunity. Now, Russia is using it. I think North Korea have used VX to assassinate someone, and other dictators will use the same thing. So unless you have United Nations or some countries that used to be the United States or NATO to enforce certain norms in the world, then bad actors will do what is being done now to the Rohingya. I think also we are bombarded by too much news. In the United States, we are focused on ourselves a lot. I mean, I watch the CNN every day. I don't see anything that is happening in the world. I don't see anything about the Rohingya or about Syria or about Africa or about Europe. All what I see is tweets and analysis of tweets. And this is not right. I mean, I think the main component of democracy is to have informed citizenry so they can act. And if we're not informed about what's happening in the rest of the world or about what's happening in our backyard, then we're not going to have ideal democracy. So I think part of it is really to blame the media and blame institutions that are making us segregated or separated from the rest of the world. If people pay attention, if every person or most people in the United States are like you, who come on Thursday night to listen to a lecture about the Rohingya, I think the world would be in much better situation.
Senator Durbin.
Let me follow that up with two observations, and one that Dr. Sahloul did not make, maybe could not make, and I want to make. The first is this crisis fatigue, the fact that we now have more refugees in the world than ever, 65 million. And we have now been told this is not our problem. The official government position of the United States under this administration is this is not our problem. We are reducing the number of refugees allowed into the United States by half under this president, from 100,000 to 50,000. 50,000 against 65 million. We're not going to take 65 million people, but for the longest time, we did lead the world in accepting refugees. And if you think back just in my lifetime, where those refugees came from, they came from Cuba, lots of them. They came from South Vietnam, Soviet Jews. There were refugees from all over the world, from Africa and other places, who have been assimilated into the United States. Many, if they could, would return. Others struggled to make a life here. But despite the number of crises in the world and the refugee challenge, which the Jewish people understand more than any other group in history, we are being told this is not our problem. Our problem is America first. America first. The second part of this, and I'll be very blunt about it, is the fact that if you look at the worst humanitarian crises currently that I can think of, the Rohingya, maybe 1 million people there who are facing it. Dr. Sahloul, any idea how many people have died or injured in Syria to this date? Do you have a number?
500,000, according to the UN, were killed. Half of the population have been displaced. 5.5 million refugees, which is quarter of the population, and about 2 million who are injured.
Now go to Yemen. In Yemen, some 16 million people currently need humanitarian assistance. 8 million people in famine in Yemen. We're fueling the planes that are striking Yemen. We're going to debate this in the Senate next week. What do those three scenarios have in common? The Rohingya, the Syrian situation, and the Yemeni situation. We're talking about Muslim people. And we know what's going on here when conversation turns to the Muslim population in this country. And it breaks my heart that we have decided that, some have decided that this is, quote, the challenge for America. And I will just say that as one who is not, I'm Christian, and I believe that this nation has been built on the acceptance of people of all religion. We don't discriminate, nor should we. So I think part of the reason why the Rohingya issue is not in the forefront, too many crises, many of them involving Muslim people, and a message from the highest levels of government that this is not our problem.
So I'm going to ask one last question from me, and then I want to open it up to the audience. And this is to any and all of you sitting here. So one thing that's very important to us at the museum is to not only shed a light on what's happening, but to give people tools to inspire them to take action. And so I would ask you all to think about and share with us, what can we here tonight that are here listening and are inspired, what can we do to make a difference on this issue?
I'll start, maybe. Can I show some pictures?
Please, yes.
So I'll start with the quote. I read it in your annual dinner, that one person speaking up will create more noise than 10,000 people who are silent, right? So speak up on behalf of people who are oppressed. I think that's part of any religion and any faith, and part of us as Americans. That's why we send medical missions to the Rohingya, because we believe in serving people regardless of their ethnic or religious affiliation. And we believe in cultural sensitivity, so we are sending very diverse groups of doctors who are Christians, Jews, Buddhists, Hindus, and Muslims to serve the people of Rohingya. We orient them about the culture. These are not Rohingya refugees, these are Syrian refugees, but the faces are the same. When you go to these camps, more than 50% of the people in the camps are children. 50% of the camps are children. That means children will grow without proper education. And then maybe 10 years from now, we're going to talk about how come that we have terrorists in the world. If you do not give children tools to be educated and hope to become teachers and nurses and firefighters and so forth, they're going to grow up to be something else. These are some of the pictures from the camps. This is Balokali camp, and you just stand there and you see tents. And I asked my wife and myself to go inside the tent because we are privileged in Chicago. We live in houses that has air condition and heat, and in the winter, and all kind of luxury things. Most of us, I guess. But when you are inside these basic tents, there's nothing there. It's hot in the summer, very hot. It's very cold in the winter. In Bangladesh, there's no winter. It's hot and humid always. And they don't have the basic things that you need. But it's very warm because I believe that God is inside the tent. God is very close to people who are oppressed. And this is Dr. Quraishi, Hina Quraishi, taking care of one of the Rohingya women and her child who was dehydrated and he had pneumonia and he was breathing really hard. So she took care of him, she touched him. She is a pediatrician from DC area. She took 1 week off from her busy schedule. This is our clinic. Basic, very basic. This is Dr. Ibrahim. This is your wife. Taking care of a child. Other children are beautiful everywhere. And when you establish this human connection, it's very difficult to forget about the Rohingya. This is Senator Durbin and Congresswoman Schakowsky in the camp. This is a refugee who had difficulty seeing things, and then we had self-adjusting glasses. We gave it to him, we adjusted it, and he was able to read. He was very happy. You changed his life forever. Our team, very diverse team. This is Dr. Orvstadter. She's from Finland. She went there and volunteered with us. Sometimes hugging the refugees. This guy was crying. He said, I have no hope. I want to go back to Myanmar to be killed. So we hugged him. We told him that we're going to convey what we have seen to our policymakers. This is probably the best thing that he had for some time. These are two couples who decided to go to Rohingya. Both of them are doctors instead of spending their anniversary in Dubai. And this is the same picture I showed you in the second mission. Dr. Quraishi went there and the child was cured and he was very happy and smiling, and his mom is smiling. So planting a smile on the face of refugee is the most precious thing that you can do in the world. I'll end with this picture.
So I'll just ask if either of you have anything to add about what we can do.
Yeah, I would echo Dr. Sahloul's comments. I think the most important thing is to keep yourself informed. Our attention is being pulled in all directions from the media, and I think the most important thing is to keep yourself informed. I don't believe that there's going to be any political solutions to this anytime soon. I do believe, however, that there may come a time in the future in which the perpetrators of these crimes, the architects of this, are brought to justice. And for something like that to happen, the political environment has to change dramatically. If you look at the Bosnian situation, for example, it was only after Serbia wanted to join the European Union that that was a precondition to hand over the perpetrators, and all of a sudden they all ended up in The Hague. So much of it will take time, but the key thing for something like that to happen is to keep this in the public domain and to keep it in the forefront of the minds of policymakers to ensure that something like this can transpire. And I think that's probably the most important thing that we can do, is to try to keep ourselves informed and keep those around us informed as best as we can of the situation.
I'm going to suggest three things. When I first started as a college student working in the office of a U.S. Senator from Illinois named Paul Douglas, he used to insist on signing every letter that went out of his office. And so at 5 o'clock at night, they would type the letters, carbon paper. Anybody remember carbon paper? Type the letters, stack them up. He would sign them. He'd lost use of his left arm. He was injured in World War II. But with one hand, and interns like me would sit next to him and pull the letters as he signed them. He did it every night. No letter went out without Mr. D reading the letter and putting a note on it, making a correction if necessary. I now live in a world where I receive 10,000 emails a week. Seeing them, let alone reading them, is impossible, physically impossible. It's all I would do. So the staff calls through them and tells me, we're getting a lot of mail about something, we're getting big response to this, and so forth. Emails that you send to members of Congress raising this issue or others issues important to you may not get the direct attention of that member of Congress, but it at least registers when they report the mail to me. Did you know you got 1,000 letters last week on the Rohingya? I did. Really? Well, I better take a look at that. And let me look at the reply. What are you sending back here? Let's see what we're saying. And what is going on? What should we be doing? Those emails that you sent have an impact. Second question here. How many people in this audience are on Facebook? 40% of the American people get their news off of Facebook. And the most credible news that they receive is from a friend. If a friend says, why don't you read this article and tell me if you like it or you want to comment on it? That is transfer of information, which people find 40% of Americans. That's how they're informed. It isn't ABC, NBC, CNN, or anything. It's Facebook. So the question I'll ask these two gentlemen is there a way that we can get access to good, short, important, truthful information about the Rohingya that we can share on Facebook pages with the people that we read and read us? That to me would be a step forward, educating people through the medium that is now the most effective. And the third is, Dr. Sahloul has a group called MedGlobal. It is a 501c3 organization which accepts contributions. There are others which we all know, Médecins Sans Frontières, all these groups that are engaged in this work. A little help there wouldn't hurt either.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'd love to make sure we...
Can I answer?
Yes, please.
So in our Facebook, MedGlobal homepage, we have stories every day from our doctors and nurses who go to the field and they report what they see. Sometimes it's a medical story, sometimes it's a personal story, how they were touched by what they have seen, pictures of refugees, the refugee camp, their reflections. And I feel these are very powerful stories. And MedGlobal.
So is there questions from the audience? Yes, I see that there are a number. I'm going to let my colleague take control.
Thank you for sharing with us what's happening. Dr. Ibrahim, I have a question. It's for all of you, but it might be more in your expertise. I'm wondering if the Buddhist leaders in Myanmar have any kind of affiliation with Buddhist leaders internationally, and whether the international Buddhist community has been speaking about this to try to have some influence on what's happening.
That's a great question. A very common question as well, because people are totally perplexed when you tell them that some of these atrocities are being perpetrated by Buddhists. You know, Buddhism for us is a religion that we see is just totally at peace. You know, these are people that do not even kill insects, and even when they have bad thoughts, you need to cleanse yourself. But the difference is that the Buddhism that they follow in Myanmar is not the Buddhism that you and I may be familiar with. It's not the Buddhism of the Dalai Lama. Most of them don't recognize the Dalai Lama. They believe that he's a fraud. It's a form of Buddhism known as Theravada Buddhism, which can be very militant in its nature. So many of them believe that for Buddhism to thrive, all other ideologies have to be kept in check and have to be suppressed. So you look at some of the atrocities that are being perpetuated, behind them is actually a lot of the Buddhist monks. There's a famous one that was on the cover of Time magazine, Ashin Varathu, and you look at some of his speeches, and he's a very, very strange character. You know, Buddhism is he wears the orange garb because it's a symbolism of withdrawing from the world, and he's an individual. He's got like a $40,000 diamond watch, and he flies in private jets, and he's got this Louis Vuitton luggage, and he's got the orange garb on. It's like a complete contrast of what one would associate with, you know, epitomizing Buddhism. And he's been one of the main perpetrators of advocating the violence. And if you look at the most senior monk in Myanmar, it's an individual called Setagu, and his speeches are online, and I wrote an article about this as well. And he clearly openly states to a hall full of army officers that these people, the Rohingya, they have been reincarnated from snakes and insects. So when you kill them, you're not actually killing human beings, you're killing vermin. And the Rohingya women it's permissible to rape them. And he gives a story of how a king had killed, a number of individuals, 400 individuals, and he was very disturbed by that. And so the Buddhist monks came to him in the middle of the night and said to the king that, look, we know you can't sleep, but those people that you killed, they were not real, they weren't Buddhist, they did not follow the 5 principles of Buddha, so they were only half human. So the implications being that you can kill them, it's not a problem. So he's saying this is the kind of language that's going down. And we were talking earlier about Facebook. Facebook has been the main mechanism by which this hatred has actually spread. And the United Nations Special Envoy to Myanmar, Professor Yang Hee Lee, has actually said that Facebook has become a beast. And that's her words, not mine. She said it's become a beast because it's been the main vehicle by which a lot of this hatred is actually spread. And Facebook has actually, they've done nothing about it so far because they claim they do not have enough expertise and presence in the country to actually monitor the hate speech.
Thank you. A question for Senator Durbin. Senator, first of all, thank you so much for coming out. I'm sure we all appreciate it. A point of information. When President Obama left office, shortly before leaving, he made a trip to Asia. I believe Myanmar was about the last spot or so. Do you have any idea how much aid was promised to Myanmar after that trip? Or during the trip?
I don't know what he may have promised, but we have been watching the money going to Myanmar closely. Here is the dilemma we often face. There is need for basic human development, human assistance, food, clean water, things of that nature. But we don't want a penny to go to the Burmese military, to the Myanmar military, because of the horrible things which they've been guilty of. And we often run into a dilemma. Are we going to cut off a country because the leaders have become dictatorial or an army is in charge? What is the impact on the people who live in the country? So what we're trying to do is to sort that out and to move any assistance that we send through organizations we can trust that will actually give to needy, deserving people and not in any way assist the military leaders in that country. I don't know if there was any specific promise made.
Thank you so much for all your insights. I've in fact had the pleasure of hearing Dr. Ibrahim and Dr. Sahloul very recently at the University of Chicago, and I'm honored to have you here today, Senator Durbin. I am currently in a policy lab at the University of Chicago, which analyzes the impact of burning villages in Myanmar. So we use satellite imagery and thermal, we analyze imagery by NASA and Planet Labs to analyze thermal anomalies to assess how much burnings there have been and whether they coincide with only Rohingya villages that are being burned, to potentially come up with evidence that, okay, this is like targeted persecution. My question is, when we have this evidence, I think we already have enough evidence, but we haven't been able to do anything as an international community to put an end to conflict. I mean, the international community at the UN is still debating whether it is a genocide or not. How much evidence do you need? Do you think we should change our approach instead and focus on conflict resolution and reconciliation between the local population inside Burma, between the Arakan Buddhists and the Rohingyas, and awaken public opinion inside Burma? Because a government is unlikely to change its actions against it's afraid of its own people. So should we look at that strategy instead?
Thank you so much for the question. Thanks so much for the work that you're also doing. I am familiar with it. Regarding the question on genocide, when my book was first published, it was called Inside Myanmar's Hidden Genocide. And I remember a number of editors contacted me saying that this is being alarmist. And the same editors actually contacted me recently saying that you were absolutely right. I use very specifically that word genocide. I believe it is a genocide. I believe history will show it's a genocide. It is not termed as a genocide at the moment for political reasons, because if it's termed as a genocide, it no longer needs a Security Council resolution that automatically will permit the R2P to take effect, which means that the international community will have to take action. And when there's no political appetite to intervene, then they will do everything possible to avoid using the word genocide. I think the UN, many officials at the UN have gone as far as possible to say, Professor Yang Hee Lee said it bears all the hallmarks of a genocide, which is about as diplomatically as far as you can say as to saying it is a genocide. So irrespective of how much evidence you have, and when I was researching my book, I looked at the situation in Rwanda. I spoke to a number of people that were actually intimately involved, and they told me explicitly that, look, everybody knew exactly what was going on. 10,000 people a day were being killed, 10,000, and they weren't being gassed or bombed, they were being chopped up by machetes. The UN knew exactly what was going on, but there was no political appetite to intervene in this landlocked African country that nobody knew anything about. So they'll play around with words, ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity, and so on until the time passes and no intervention is required. So this is all a political mechanism rather than... What was the second part of your question?
Should we focus on reconciliation?
Yeah. I think that's always very, very helpful dialogue between populations. The difficulty is that the animosity towards the Rohingya in Myanmar itself has reached such levels that they have no champions within even civil society. Even the pro-democracy activists in the past no longer, even nobody in Myanmar will even use the word Rohingya. They will not even use that word Rohingya. The animosity is so great against them. That obviously does not mean that initiatives should not be taken to try to bring some sort of understanding to the situation. But it's a very, very difficult and complex situation at the moment.
United Nations observers who were there told us a story of a woman in the Rakhine State, a Buddhist woman, who sold vegetables to the Rohingya people. And she was admonished by her village and forced to sit in public wearing a sign that said traitor, because she had actually done commerce with these people. So reconciliation is a long way away. And I think most of us question why they would return to this in light of what they've been through.
Can I say something about this? Because there is a lot of parallel between what's happening to the Rohingya and what's happening in Syria. In Syria, as I mentioned, there were many uses of chemical weapon attacks with sarin gas, with choking agents, chlorine gas, with even a mustard gas, blistering agents. Was well documented by Syrian doctors. We actually, in my organization, Syrian American Medical Society, we trained them how to document, take samples from the hair, from the clothing, from the sand, from the blood, send it to labs that documented that sarin gas was used and chlorine gas was used. We testified in the United Nations Security Council. We pushed actually the United Nations Security Council to establish Joint Investigation Mission, GIM, that actually went to Syria and interviewed witnesses and took samples and confirmed that the Syrian regime have used chemical weapons in at least 5 circumstances. Then Russia blocked that investigation team. As long as you have one country, a permanent member of the Security Council that supports a regime, then there is no justice. Russia supports Myanmar. China supports Myanmar. So it's very unlikely that Myanmar will be referred to ICC or that you will have court to have justice for the perpetrator. Unfortunately, this will lead to chaos at one point because you have many criminals who are doing these crimes with impunity. I believe in reconciliation in Syria, but I spoke with refugees and they told me we lost everything. How would you like us to go back to Syria with the same regime that killed our families and destroyed our neighborhood and pushed us away? It's very difficult. Without justice, without transitional justice, it's very difficult to have national reconciliation. That's why both are linked.
So a brief digression before getting to my central point. Senator Durbin brought up the name of the late great Paul Douglas, who, for those of you who weren't alive at the time, was known as the conscience of the US Senate. And I think it would behoove anyone here who isn't familiar with Senator Douglas to Google him. He truly did credit to the state. As I recall, he had an ironclad rule that he would never accept a gift over $10. And it's pretty hard to compromise yourself if you adhere to a rule like that. But anyway, on to the matter at hand. First of all, I want to thank all of you for your very trenchant and poignant exposition of the problems facing these beleaguered people. I was initially when I arrived, going to offer some anecdotes, personal anecdotes of my own, because I had considerable contact with Aung San Suu Kyi at Oxford through her late husband, who was based at St. Anthony's College there. But in light of the discussion, I'd like to actually take a different tack, and also in the interest of brevity, and push back a little. And offer something of a contrarian view, but hopefully do so in a very constructive way. So one of the questions, one of the themes that seems to have come through this evening is what can we do to galvanize public support? And as I'm sitting here listening to the discussion tonight, and I would, with all due respect, especially direct this to Senator Durbin, now that I've buttered you up, I think it's perhaps counterproductive to turn these humanitarian crises into political issues where we point the finger. I think back, and I could harken back even further, but I think back to President Clinton's presidency, where he wrote in his memoirs that his greatest regret was not doing more about the Rwandan genocide. And you know, the Syrian humanitarian crisis did not exactly start with the advent of the Trump administration. You know, and the use of chemical weapons in Syria did not start. And as I recall, President Obama drew a red line with regards to chemical weapons and didn't follow that. I mean, I could obviously elaborate, but the broader point here is, rather than taking sides, rather than pointing a finger at Senator McConnell, or pointing a finger at this party or that party, or making snide comments about the current occupant of the White House, I think we're better served as a people if we focus on what we can do, rather than playing a blame game and looking at culpability.
Can I say that? I'll just follow on from your comment on Aung San Suu Kyi, because I've met numerous people who have met her, I've known her intimately, and who say, well, look, she doesn't control the military. Yeah, she's actually a hostage. You know, how do you know what's actually going on in the country? And I fully accept she does not control the military directly, but she does have a very powerful weapon, probably the most powerful weapon, which she has consistently refused to use, and that is her voice. She's a moral conscience of that country, and she has consistently refused to say anything at all, even use the word Rohingya. Now, one of the key questions I get asked very often is, why is this happening now? Why is this happening in 2016, when you say that this persecution has been going on for half a century? Well, the military, this is very common for genocides. It's very common for the perpetrators to undertake a dry run, a test run, to see what's going to be the reaction of not just local politics, but also the international community. Exactly the same thing happened in Rwanda as well. And the military undertook a dry run of this in October 2016, in which they burnt down a few dozen villages and expelled 140,000 Rohingya into Bangladesh. And they learnt three things from that, three very important lessons, which they realised that they can now execute the final solution. The first thing they learnt is that Aung San Suu Kyi defends the military in public. She becomes a shield for all international criticism against the military. For example, when the United Nations produced a report in March 2017 saying that 52% of Rohingya women had been raped, Aung San Suu Kyi said, "This is fake rape." When the BBC's Fergal Keane pressed her on the ethnic cleansing, she said, "This is far too strong a term to use for what is happening, and both sides are equally to blame," which is the moral equivalence of saying both the Jews and the Nazis were to blame for the Holocaust, or both the blacks and the whites were to be blamed for apartheid South Africa. Most people would recognise that as moral bankruptcy. When the UN said we want a full fact-finding mission, she said, "This will not be very helpful." And she might not control the military, but she is the foreign minister of that country, and she blocked the visas for UN investigators in the same way she blocked the Senate delegation to come into that country. And this is the first thing they learned. The second thing the military learned is that despite all the evidence of ethnic cleansing, genocide, rapes, and so on, General Min Aung Hlaing was still given a VIP invitation to Europe. Austria and Germany literally rolled out the red carpet for him, and as if nothing had ever happened. So they realised that, look, there's going to be no comeback on this at all. See, these are very important things that we see that lay the foundations for this violence, and then they can realise that they can actually take this up to the next level and execute the final solution.
I'd like to respond to the political side of this for a moment. I worked for Paul Simon for a number of years, and he may be more responsible for my being here than most. And when he was chairman of the Africa Subcommittee of the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee, his ranking Republican was Jim Jeffords of Vermont. And they saw and heard from Romeo Dallaire and others what was coming in Rwanda. Jeffords and Simon, on a bipartisan basis, went to Madeleine Albright and Bill Clinton and said, send in some U.S. military profile presence. It could intervene and stop this from cascading into something terrible. No one even envisioned that it was going to reach 800,000 deaths. But Simon and Jeffords, on a bipartisan basis, went to Albright and Clinton and said, we foresee the possibility of a genocide in Rwanda. If you will recall, the Clinton administration, and Bill Clinton and I went to college together, and I supported him all those years, and I'm a Democrat and all the rest, refused to acknowledge that a genocide was going to occur or did occur, even after the fact, and sent in no support. It ended up, when it was over, and Clinton reflected on his presidency, he conceded. It was one of his biggest mistakes. I will say the same when it comes to President Obama and Syria. I'm probably closer to President Obama than most, and encouraged him to run for president and believe he was an extraordinarily good president. But we failed in Syria. The world failed, but we failed in Syria. We're in the 7th year, are we not, of this conflict, with all of the deaths associated with it. In a democracy, you have to be willing to say what I just said about your own party, and not afraid to say something about the other party. When Trump made a conscious decision to cut the number of refugees coming into the United States in half, from 100,000 to 50,000, that was a devastating decision. Not just for the lives affected by it, but the image of the United States. After World War II and the SS St. Louis, we wanted to show the world we were different. Now we're showing them we're withdrawing from this responsibility. When he calls for cutting back in foreign aid, even foreign aid to Jordan, is there any country on earth that has accepted more refugees than Jordan? For goodness sakes, to cut back on assistance to them while we're cutting back on accepting refugees, Tillerson, former Secretary Tillerson, could not even explain that situation to me. How could we do this? We won't accept these refugees, and we won't provide King Hussein in Jordan the resources to care for these people? I mean, these are conscious policy decisions being made by our government today. And as I found fault with Clinton on Rwanda, with Obama on Syria, I am loath to sit back and say, as a Democrat, I dare not say anything about the current administration. I can't do that. These decisions affect human life, and they affect our ability to help and our reputation in the world.
One last question. We're going to have one last question. I think someone had the mic. Do you have one last question?
Yes.
Please.
We are American Sikhs, and we represent Chicagoland, American Sikh community. I have heard a lot, and thanks for actually invitation. And we have learned a lot about what's happening in Bangladesh and all the Muslim refugees, and also in Syria. I believe that, and I know that you have been to all these places, Syria and Bangladesh and Myanmar and Yemen. And I also understand the situation of the current US government, America first. If America is the biggest country on the earth, richest country on the earth, who else can help these people? I don't think any help will come from European countries. China is a rich country, Japan, South Korea, Russia. I don't think they are doing anything. My question is, You've been to Middle East. How about those countries, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Bahrain? I have visited all those countries. They are very rich countries. They have a lot of money. Anybody can tell us that anything they can do for their own brothers? Or you guys have met those people there to tell them the whole situation, what we learn over here? That's my question, that if USA cannot do, Europe cannot do, how about their own brothers living in very close by? Thank you.
Let me defer to Dr. Sahloul because you've seen these NGOs on the ground and you can comment on where the help is coming from.
Well, when I went to Greece, actually, let me go back. I've seen many NGOs from all over the world. I mean, first of all, we have to believe in humanity. I've seen NGOs that has Palestinian doctors and NGOs that had Israeli doctors helping Syrian refugees in Greece. I've never imagined that you will have that much goodness in the world. When I went to Rohingya, there's many NGOs that came from Malaysia, from Indonesia, from Red Crescent, of course, from Turkey. Turkey is one of the main countries that is supporting the Rohingya refugees. And actually, they are one of the countries that convinced the Bangladeshi government to open the borders to the Rohingya refugees, because without that, I don't think that Bangladesh would have opened the border. And they promised that they will support humanitarian assistance to the Rohingya refugee. Turkey is, as you know, majority Muslim countries. I'm not here to defend these countries. I mean, I'm American, although I am Muslim, but I believe that America has major role to play. But these countries have their own limitation. Some of them are very generous in their humanitarian assistance. Kuwait, for example, supports a lot of humanitarian assistance through the UN. The same thing with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia in the 1970s opened the door to 200,000 Rohingya refugees in the first displacement. And if you go to Saudi Arabia, you will see many people who do not look like Arabs. They look like from South Asia, and they are the second and third generation of Myanmaris, of Muslim from Myanmar, from the Rohingya, who settled in Saudi Arabia by King Faisal, one of the older kings. So I think these countries are doing what they can do. It's not enough, definitely, and I think they can be pressured by our government. They respond to pressure very well, and we can pressure them to open the door and to provide more humanitarian assistance. But I believe that we can do more, like you.
If we're wrapping up, could I ask permission for 60 seconds or 90 seconds?
Well, I didn't give you a bio, so you can take that time.
Most everyone here knows the story of the SS St. Louis. I'm sure you've all heard the story of this ship of 900 passengers of refugees, Jewish refugees mainly, who came to the United States in 1939 seeking to escape the Nazis. And I want to tell a little story about some of those passengers. Among the artifacts in this museum are the passports of two passengers who boarded the SS St. Louis. Their names were Rudolph and Therese Goldreich. Therese's friends and family called her Rose. The Goldreichs lived in Vienna, Austria, then under Nazi control. When the St. Louis was rejected, turned away, and returned to Europe, Rudolph and Rose found temporary refuge in Belgium. Before long, the Nazis then invaded Belgium. Belgian authorities worried that Rudolph might be a German spy. They arrested him and sent him to the Gurs concentration camp in southwest France. Rose, who must have been an extraordinarily remarkable woman, located him, traveled through the war zone to Gurs, and managed to get his release. She's pretty persuasive. The couple then moved to Marseille and applied again for visas, but the U.S. consulate was closed for the summer. Fortunately, Rose's daughter Irene was a tough and persistent woman. She wrote letter after letter to anyone she could think of who might help her family reach America. One of her letters reached First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. A few weeks later, Rudolph and Rose Goldreich were called to the U.S. consulate in Marseille, which was still closed, and issued their visas. That is how the Goldreichs reached America in 1941. And their passports are here. The reason I know this story is because Rudolph and Rose Goldreich's great-granddaughter, Rachel Chaikin, works for me. She's my scheduler, and she's the reason I'm here tonight. And Rachel and her husband, Steve, have two little kids, very bright kids, a girl and a boy, and they're here this evening. Rachel, hold up your hand.
Thank you, Rachel, for making this possible. Thank you so much, Dr. Sahloul, Dr. Ibrahim, Senator Durbin. It has been my honor to be on the stage with you. Thank you all for coming. We actually have a book signing available after. If you are interested in Dr. Ibrahim's book, it is a great read, and you will come out feeling much more knowledgeable and inspired. And we hope that we will see you another evening or another Sunday or another day at the museum where you can experience another conversation like this one. Thank you all for coming.